When you talk to companies about how they work, usually within the first couple minutes, someone is going to mention the intent graph, and it's going to look something like this. Now, there are obviously variations to this, but it's going to have 3-year goals, 1-year goals, strategic opportunities, or bets. Like that's an example of a less prescriptive intent graph. Sometimes you're going to see things that are a lot more prescriptive, like strategic pillars, annual enterprise goals, functional department OKRs, key initiatives, projects or epics or work items. There are differences between these depending on companies, but usually within a couple minutes, someone will mention this intent graph when you ask them how they work, and this is the first thing they answer with, one of these intent graphs. These are interesting and they're helpful, but they're just such a small piece of the picture. And I'll just give you a couple examples of how these are only one part of the picture. So, I showed you a graph before and I said, this is more prescriptive, but let's imagine two organizations right here. So this organization, Org A, the teams actually own up into the key initiatives and they influence the strategy and context flows down. There's a loop there. Okay, well, that's going to be a very, very different company than a situation where leadership, management, leadership, whatever you want to call it, owns all the way down to the work items and teams are relegated there. That's one example where just by looking at the work tree, you're not going to see a lot, or just by looking at the intent graph, you're not going to see a lot. Another example, two organizations have key initiatives and programs. Okay, that's interesting. But for Org A, there's an average of 2.5 tribes and 4.3 teams and maybe 12 to 20 weeks involved with these key initiatives. And in Org B, it's very, very different. There's 1.1 tribe, there's 1.4 teams, and maybe 2 to 4 weeks for one of these initiatives. That's very different. So just by seeing that intent tree, you might not really be able to understand the difference. Another example, imagine an organization, it's got a shared team. You've got 4 departments. All the departments say their thing is a P0. But if you were to look at the shared team and look at the difference in urgency or cost of delay for each of these particular items, they might be vastly different. And yet the budgets for these departments are each being allocated separately among the 4 departments. That would be very, very different than a situation where there was common budgeting or prioritization between those departments. Another example, let's say that you have a company where the teams are sort of aligned this way. They're aligned against some input metrics that are maybe connected to a North Star metric. These teams are trying and monitoring different experiments, let's say, and there's only minimal dependencies. Well, that's going to be very different than a team that might be trying the same thing, but there's lots of dependencies between these teams and all the work kind of goes into this pretty heavy duty rollout phase. And then there's a lot of question about how that fits into the overall metrics hierarchy. Another example of where these trees fall flat is, okay, you have an initiative, but let's just think about the different types of teams that you would have. You'd have new offerings or areas of strategic expansion or growth acceleration or margin optimization or operational optimization, reset and repair across teams. And if you extend these descriptions to maybe the initiatives that would be common for these teams, you can just see how vastly different the shape of work might be for these different groups. It's really hard to see that from just the standard tree. Another example, think about an organization where they have 3 business segment teams, each has P&L, a GM, and a business leader. And then tech has a single R&D budget. And all these different segments crisscross the same experience layer, I guess. And then technology has a bunch of products and platforms and core and enabling groups. Now, there's nothing wrong with this particular setup. But if you have a setup like this, you're going to need to be very intentional about how you map these different contexts together to be able to understand what's happening. Otherwise, you're liable to waste a lot of money. Another example here, imagine 2 teams. You've got a checkout conversion team. They've got these very concrete actionable metrics like checkout form completion rate, payment success rate. They have a team goal of improved successful completed checkouts. That's a very, very clear connection to revenue. Now, this goes without saying that design system teams are very, very important, but its connection to revenue would be somewhat different. It's slightly less tangible input metrics. The team goal is really important, but it's going to take a couple hops to get from this team to improving component quality, to teams ship faster, to products become more consistent, customers trust the experience, retention improves, revenue increases. Now, again, you need both teams like this, but when you're going back and if you're looking at some kind of intent hierarchy like this, saying, well, what projects do we have on tap? It's going to tell you nothing about, for example, how these 2 teams might be connected to revenue and how you might think about the ROI for those particular groups. So what we're getting at here is that sometimes, in some parts of an organization or maybe in a startup or, if you're lucky, I guess across the whole organization, these different views or perspectives like intent, funding, the value chain, maybe the context and collaboration, it's like a Venn diagram. And you can imagine that these are so overlapped that you don't really need to jump back and forth between these contexts or perspectives to make sense of things. But there's many situations, as companies grow and change, these circles are always separating, maybe coming back together. So you're going to have many situations where you need to provide interfaces to be able to better understand these things. Like, obviously, it's better if you're pushing everything to the center when you can, but it's never going to be perfect. In fact, if it was perfect, you would probably not be growing anymore, and you wouldn't really be taking any risks, and there would be no uncertainty in your domain, in which case that's not a great business to be in. So this is part of operations, is you're going to always be experiencing this push and pull between pretty coherent situations where things just naturally map across each other to situations where you're going to need to provide the connectivity between ideas to make sense of things. Hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks.